The 1980s in Formula One racing saw some of the most talented and skilled drivers to ever grace the sport. It was a time when F1 was rapidly growing and gaining more fans across the globe. It was a decade that witnessed a fair share of drama, close finishes, and fierce rivalries that are still remembered to this day, and was perhaps the most pivotal decade for the sport as it moved closer to the Formula One that we know and love in the modern era. It happens at GPFans that once we got discussing the topic of the 1980s, we naturally moved to the debate of the best drivers of the decade. So after much squabbling and in no particular order, here are who we think are the top 10 drivers of the 1980s in Formula One. Before we get into it, just a reminder, if there's anybody we've left out, you can get onto gpfans.com and GPFans Global and let us know who we should have put in our top 10, and of course let us know in the comments section down below. But here are those drivers that dominated the 1980s. Ayrton Senna. Let's start with the maestro of the decade and the most obvious one, the late Brazilian driver Ayrton Senna. Senna made his F1 debut in 1984 with the Toleman team, but it was with Lotus that he made a name for himself, winning his first Grand Prix in Portugal the following year. His career highlights in the 1980s included his breathtaking performances in the wet, particularly his win at the 1985 Portuguese Grand Prix, where he overtook almost the entire field after starting in 13th. Senna's other major memorable win came at the 1986 Spanish Grand Prix, where he masterfully managed to stay ahead of the more powerful Williams throughout the race, despite having an inferior engine. This was the decade where Senna jumped onto the scene and everybody was paying attention. Niki Lauda. Moving on, we have the Austrian driver Niki Lauda. Lauda won the championship for Ferrari in 1984 using his experience and technical knowledge to outsmart his younger opponents. Lauda's most famous race of the decade came at the 1984 Monaco Grand Prix, where he pulled off a stunning victory that he credited solely to his team's brilliant strategy. His driving skills were amazing, especially in races held under wet conditions, and Lauda is one of Formula One's all-time greats, especially in that decade. Alain Prost. Next on the list comes the flying Frenchman Alain Prost. Prost's skills were all about precision, and he was widely renowned for being a strategic thinker. Prost won 2 world championships in the 80s in 1985 and 1986 with McLaren. In the 1985 season, he beat his arch-rival Niki Lauda to clinch the title by just a half point in a nail-biting finale in Adelaide. The latter part of the decade saw the start of the iconic rivalry between he and Ayrton Senna, and it would be the start of arguably the greatest battle between two drivers in Formula One history. F1 was becoming box office, and Alain Prost was certainly worth paying a ticket. Nigel Mansell. At number 4, we have the moustached British driver Nigel Mansell. Mansell was widely regarded as being one of the most charismatic and popular drivers of all time. He initially struggled until he joined the Williams team in 1985, where he won his first ever race at the European Grand Prix that year. His career highlights of the decade included his 1986 British Grand Prix win, where he memorably overtook his own teammate Nelson Piquet in the closing stages of the race. Mansell won the championship in 1992, but his performances in the 80s showcased his driving skills and his fearless nature that would lead him to that title in 92. He also drove for 3 of the most iconic names in the sport in the decade: Lotus, Williams, and Ferrari. Didier Peroni. Another famous name of the decade was the French driver Didier Peroni. Peroni showed his prowess early on in his career by winning the 1980 Argentinian Grand Prix. His career highlights of the decade came the following year when he won consecutive races in Belgium and San Marino before his career was tragically cut short due to an accident during qualifying for the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim. Peroni's life was a mix of tragedy and controversy in Formula One, and for a driver with such talent, there was often a dark cloud following in his slipstream. Nelson Piquet. Another Brazilian driver to make our list is Nelson Piquet. Piquet was widely renowned for his strategic prowess and know-how. He was able to make his Brabham car seemingly more competitive than his rivals, and he won the championship in 1981, 1983, and again in 1987. Piquet's performances were consistent throughout the decade, and he proved to be a true contender, coming in second place several times. His controversial departure from Williams after the 1987 season may have marred the decade slightly, but the 3 World Championships make him one of the most successful drivers to ever race in the sport, let alone in the 1980s. Keke Rosberg. Next, we have the talented Finnish driver Keke Rosberg. Rosberg made his debut in 1978, but achieved his best results in the 1980s, most notably clinching the championship in 1982. Rosberg showcased his skills at the Monaco Grand Prix that year, where he pulled off a legendary performance under changeable weather conditions to beat Alain Prost and Gilles Villeneuve to the checkered flag. Gerhard Berger. The rise of the Ferrari driver was a slow process throughout the 1980s, as Gerhard Berger made his debut in Formula One in 1984. By 1985, the Austrian had found a permanent seat in the sport, albeit at the back of the grid with Barclay's Arrows BMW. But a year later, with Benetton, Berger was showing what he could do at the highest level, finishing 7th in the championship that year thanks to his first win in Mexico. By the end of the decade, 6 more Grand Prix victories were in the bag, and he amassed 13 podiums in total. A Formula One favourite began to hit his stride in the second half of the glorious 80s. John Surtees. Okay, so this came from an impassioned speech by someone in the office, and really after it happened, we had to have John Surtees on our list. Surtees was a British driver who made his name in the sport actually in the 1960s, but his performances in the 80s also warrant recognition. Surtees had founded his own team called the Surtees Racing Organisation, and he participated in several Grand Prix in 1981. He was one of the very few drivers in the history of the sport to have won the F1 and Motorcycle World Championships, and that alone warrants him being on our list. Emerson Fittipaldi. And finally, our last featured driver is the talented Brazilian Emerson Fittipaldi. Fittipaldi had already enjoyed considerable success in the 1970s, but he was able to continue his impressive performances throughout the 1980s when he raced for the John Player Special team. Fittipaldi is famous for driving with remarkable smoothness and precision, and his career highlights of the decade include winning the 1980 Long Beach Grand Prix and finishing second in the 1984 Canadian Grand Prix. So there you have it, 10 of our favourite drivers from the 1980s, but who should have made our list? As always, we want to know in the comments section below who perhaps we've missed out, or anybody else who needs to be removed from our list ASAP. And remember, you can get on the GPFans Global and gpfans.com for all of the latest breaking news in the modern era of Formula One.